Welcome to the last lecture of the year talking about evolution. Learning targets. Understand Charles Darwin's voyage. Understand Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. Identify evidence for evolution. Identify the modern synthesis. And understand the difference between macro and micro evolution. So Charles Darwin was a guy who actually ended up more or less running away from home. So he was supposed to go to school to be a doctor, and he was going to go to college to be a surgeon because that's what his family thought he should do, and he fainted at the sight of blood. And so his family said, well, since you can't do that, you're going to go and be a priest. And he didn't like that idea either. So since he was kind of tired of his family deciding what he wanted to do, he ended up getting himself aboard a ship in England called the HMS Beagle as their resident naturalist. So a naturalist was basically just somebody who went out and investigated the natural world. They looked under rocks, they looked at bugs, plants, animals, you name it. Okay, so he went aboard the HMS Beagle as their naturalist. And they went on a 5-year voyage, okay, going from Plymouth, okay, all the way around, down, all right, back through Cape Town, South Africa, all right, back up to Plymouth, okay. So he went all over the globe. He went all over the world, mostly in the southern hemisphere, but he made all of these different stops, okay. And he saw a lot of things that were very curious, because what he saw were similar species in a lot of different places, but they weren't identical. Okay, and one of the big things that he did at the Galapagos Islands was he saw that there were so many species that were on the Galapagos Islands that were related or similar to species that he found in South America. Okay, and this made him think. All right, he also read the book Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell, because you're on a voyage for 5 years in the 1800s. There's no TV, no radio. So he read a lot. And one of those books was the Principles of Geology, which talked about plate tectonics and how the Earth, the physical makeup of the Earth, has shifted over the course of time. So it got Darwin thinking that if the physical Earth shifted, then maybe the biological part of Earth shifted as well. And so that's what he started to do, and he started to work through this idea. Eventually, he published a book called On the Origin of Species. And he published it with these two main theses about evolution. Something that was called descent with modification. And so that's the fact that all species have changed from an ancestral species with gradual changes over the course of time. Take our pinky finger. Okay, there is evidence to suggest that pinky fingers in humans might actually be getting shorter. Okay, and there's also evidence to suggest that human average body temperature is changing. It's no longer that 98.6. Now, the problem with descent with modification is we have to look at it over a huge span of time. Okay, and so it's very hard to sometimes for us to comprehend in our relatively short lifetimes when you think about geologic history and the Earth being, billions of years old. Okay, but what we can see through other pieces of evidence is that we can see this, and we can actually watch this with bacteria, and we can watch this with viruses. We've actually seen it happen in bacteria and viruses. In fact, that's how they make the flu vaccine every year, is they try to force the virus to mutate and change to understand how it's going to mutate and change, to then prepare for the flu vaccine for the next year. All right, natural selection is the other idea, and a lot of times people get confused, or they think evolution and natural selection are the same thing. Natural selection is the process by which evolution happens. Okay, so natural selection is based on the variation between offsprings, right? And they have differential survival, which basically means that some survive better than others. Okay, that's the whole survival of the fittest thing. Okay. All right, so that's where that survival of the fittest phrase comes from. All right, some of them survive better, okay? And then through that differential survival success, they have different reproductive success. So that basically just means they're more successful getting mates. Okay? All right. They're more successful finding mates. And if they're more successful finding mates, they're more successful having offspring. Okay? Which is basically what natural selection is. And then through the course of generations, okay, this can cause changes to the species as a whole. Right? And like I said, we can actually watch this happen in real time with bacteria, with yeast, with viruses. We can watch it happen. So there's actually quite a lot of evidence for evolution. That's one of the reasons why it's called a theory. In science, a theory means that there's a lot of evidence. There's a lot of information that supports it, and there's a lot of things that are involved with it. Whereas the law of gravity is something goes up, it comes down. That's very specific. A theory, okay, is a much broader range, but there's a lot of evidence that supports it. So when it comes to evolution, we actually have 3 really big pieces of evidence, and now we're starting to build on that with genes. And now that we're understanding genes and we can actually sequence genes, I don't know if any of you have had your DNA tested, okay, but you can get your, we can get our DNA tested and get results back in 2 weeks, all right, which is which is, when this first started, it was taking months, years, okay, to decode human genes. And now they can do it like that, okay, and we can do it with other species as well. So genetic information is actually starting to come online and supporting evolution even more. All right, so we have the fossil record, okay, based on when things die, all right, and when they get kind of stuck in the layers, we can use the fossil record. Right? We have anatomy, okay, so homologous structures. Homologous just basically means the same, all right, so you can see here all of these organisms, human, bat, porpoise, frog, horse, all have similar bone structure, okay? Some closer than others, because the porpoise and the human, right, and we're very similar, okay? And then embryology. So here you can see embryological stages, all right? And the top one, everybody looks the same. In the first few, well, depending on the species, gestation happens at different rates, but in the first few moments or chunks of gestation, okay, and then the second stage, right, it starts to differentiate a little bit, and then in this third stage, you can actually start to see, okay, the different species a little bit better, okay. So Darwin published his book in 1859. Mendel was working on his pea experiments in the 1850s and 1860s, but that information was actually lost and it wasn't rediscovered until the 1900s. So then in 1942, Julian Huxley, so this is all, I mean, I know this sounds old, okay, and I know that sounds like it was ancient history, but this is really recent in the grand scheme of things, all right? But Julian Huxley took these 2 ideas, okay, between Darwin's book and Mendel's work on genes to create what we know as the modern synthesis. Because the variation that Darwin was originally talking about is because of genes, okay? That variation is all based on genes. Right? And then, so that variation results in that idea that some are going to survive better and some are not going to survive as well. And then surviving and better reproductive success. So basically, what we finally started to understand is the fact that the gene variation that Mendel had discovered, okay, combined with this idea that species change over the course of generations, was put together, all right, to create the modern synthesis. So genes plus evolution. Actually, that's not quite right. Genes plus environment equal evolution. So microevolution is the actual changing of allele frequencies. Okay, so you can see here, all right, we have big A's, little a's. We've got some homozygous dominant, some heterozygous, some homozygous recessive. For some reason, the homozygous recessive is the best off. So in 10 generations, we're seeing more homozygous recessive, but we still have that dominant allele hanging on. Okay, and then by generation 20, all of those dominant alleles are gone. Okay, now this can ultimately result in a change of the population and a change in the species, but it doesn't always mean that we create a new species. This just might mean that this species gets better. It doesn't really change into a new species. It depends. Okay, but microevolution is actually genetic changes that, like I said, now that we can actually measure genes, okay, and actually figure out genes, and we can actually decode genes, okay, we can actually see microevolution happening, all right? Coupled with that is macroevolution. So macroevolution are the big events that actually cause changes to the species, all right? So these actually change species. So continental drift, plate tectonics, moving away from each other, mass extinctions, what killed the dinosaurs, you know, that kind of thing. What killed the dinosaurs? We don't have any more dinosaurs, okay? All of those giant lizards, gone, all right? But we have birds instead, okay? All right, but then there's also changes to genes in different ways. So there's a thing called petamorphosis. All right, petamorphosis basically means that we actually stay children longer. The longer you can stay a child or a juvenile of your species, the smarter you get. I know that sounds weird, right? Okay, but the smarter you get because the more chance your brain has to develop these things. Once you get older, all right, your brain actually has a lot harder time learning things or doing things. And so what happens is a baby chimp grows into an adult chimp a lot faster than a baby human grows into an adult human. Okay. Then we also have changes in expression of genes, so turning genes off, turning genes on, we get mutations. Okay. And then things can happen that are called selective sweeps. Those selective sweeps just mean they're so beneficial that they take relatively few generations to actually go through the population. Lactose tolerance. Okay. Lactose tolerance was so beneficial because babies that were able to still process lactose were able to stay alive over harsh winters, that they ended up surviving, whereas babies that couldn't process lactose and couldn't survive harsh winters without milk ended up passing away and not being able to pass on their genes. So that was so beneficial and caused the survival of the individuals, you know, that they ended up actually passing that gene on quite quickly, actually. All right, that's it. Have a great day.